All right, it's my pleasure to welcome you here today. My name is Tim Perfetta. I'm the director of the Nicholas Institute, one of the two co-sponsors. And first, I'd like to thank Doug and the Great Plains Institute for their partnership in this event, and then all the work we do together looking at the PJM region. And if you'll indulge me, I'd also really like to thank the team that's helped put this event together: Jess, Jen, Sarah, Amanda, Franz. We really have a pleasure. It's a pleasure to work with this group. Every organizational call is actually quite a bit of fun, which is something when you do conference calls you can't always say. So thanks to everybody who's helped us put this event together. I've very much been looking forward to this conversation. I'm really excited to kick us off. I'll make my introduction brief so we can get there. But as I look at the topic today, I think it's, what we're really looking at today is one of those great challenges that our federalist system of government brings to us. Our states are in touch with their populations and take different perspectives on key issues of environment, of reliability, of social issues of the day. And they especially do that when they don't see the federal government acting with at least the speed that they want on issues that they care about. But then in PJM, we have an institution that's faced with creating a liquid and rational market across those divergent states and their divergent policies and their divergent views. And so we are faced sometimes with the need to figure out how to make those states sing together in one market. So I'm betting today that we're going to hear some terms like balkanization and patchwork quilt in our panels today, and more than a few times. And I think finally I would observe that I think this has intensified in the last year, and because of the Trump administration's entry and their revisitation of a lot of these issues that the states care about and are moving forward on. But the PJM, being the institution it is, have not sat on their hands. They've produced a series of white papers and started conversations regarding how to approach the region's patchwork quilt, and really brought a lot of these issues straight up to the fore, and so we can consider it. So, if you look at our agenda, we have a tremendous group of colleagues with us today to consider these concepts. And I'm looking forward to the day's conversations and exploration. And with that, I'll ask my colleague, Doug, to also welcome us from Great Plains.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks, Tim. Good morning, everyone. On behalf of the Great Plains Institute, I want to welcome you to today's workshop. And to thank the folks here in Columbus and for all of you who made the trip here, and for those of you who will be watching this on stream, we want to welcome all of you today. It's great to be working with Tim and the talented folks at the Nicholas Institute. We at Great Plains Institute feel really blessed to be able to have worked with them with the PJM states for the last couple of years, and to work with them on so many other issues in this realm. We've been working with states in the PJM area for about 2 years together, first talking about Clean Power Plan, and now on a variety of issues since the Clean Power Plan is, depending on who you talk to, in various states of limbo. But a lot's happening, as you know, in PJM, and as Tim referenced, and you'll see that today as our panelists talk about. I mean, states looking at subsidies for different types of generation. Obviously, you've got the renewable energy standards and the energy efficiency standards that are in many of the states. States looking at greenhouse gas reductions on their own as something that's very important to them. And a lot of states doing utility of the future, grid hardening, grid modernization type of work, where they're adding not only new technology, but also more room for distributed generation and other types of generation. And all of that all of that plays into the markets. All of that plays into the mix of what PJM and the other RTOs and ISOs have to react to, as well as FERC. And as Tim said, PJM is actively taking up these issues, and so that's going to be a lot of what we talk about today, which is really exciting for us because there's a lot there to talk about. And I want to add my thanks to the folks from the two organizations who worked to put this together. It takes a lot of time and energy to do that, and we really appreciate all of their efforts. And so I'm looking forward to today, and hopefully you will really have an enjoyable day and one where we all learn a lot together. That's the goal. With that, let me call up the panelists for the first panel. If they could join me here on the podium. So as Tim and I both mentioned, states are pursuing a number of programs and policies which will affect the energy markets, whether that's renewable energy or efficiency, how they deal with nuclear power in their states, these utility business model or grid hardening types of initiatives, and many, many others. And I think this panel will be a great backdrop to set the stage for the discussions to come later on today and the impact on the markets and the different responses to those impacts. You've got a lot going on in the PJM region, not just from the 3 states that are represented here on the podium, but also Illinois with their Future Energy Jobs Act, which dealt not only with nuclear power, but also with renewables and energy efficiency. The grid modernization work, which is going on in a number of states right now, adding more customer choice also to the mix, and trying to figure out how that mixture of power will impact the markets. And also in Michigan, a number of issues, both legislative and through their commission that they've been dealing with as well. So there's just a lot happening in this particular region to try to unpack and sort out. And we've got the perfect panel to do that for us. Their bios are in your program, so I'm not going to go into long, lengthy introductions of each of them, although all of them obviously deserve that. They've had very, very distinguished careers that you can read about in the program. We're going to lead off with Asim Haque, who's the chair of the PUC of Ohio. And following Chairman Haque will be Andrew Place, who's the vice chair of the Pennsylvania PUC. And then to my immediate right, Mike Dowd, who is the director of the Air Division for the Virginia Department of Environmental Quality. And also Mike, we have the pleasure of working with Mike, who chairs the group of PJM air directors and utility regulators that have been meeting for the last couple of years. Each of them is just going to do maybe 5 minutes or so to talk about some of the things that are going on in their state. And then I'm going to lead a discussion with them for a period of time. And then it'll be time for you to ask questions. There will be folks when we get to that point that will be in the audience roving with microphones. Franz has one here. And so when we get to that point, Franz will come and get your mic so you can ask the questions. And I believe there is also a way for folks to ask questions online for those of you who are watching this from some other location. And so feel free to write in the questions that you have for the group as well. So with that, let me start with Chairman Haque, and then following him, Vice Chairman Place, and then Director Dowd. Chairman?
Thank you, Doug. Would you like for us to go up to the podium or stay seated? Okay, well, good morning. First of all, thank you very much to the Nicholas Institute for the invitation and for hosting this event here in Columbus, Ohio. I had the good fortune of working with the Nicholas Institute when I was very involved in all things Clean Power Plan. It is a very fine organization, and Doug is with Great Plains a wonderful, wonderful broker between the academic world and regulators. So Doug, thank you very much for all of your efforts. Welcome to the Buckeye State. A lot has happened in the Buckeye State over the past, we'll call it, well, I'm sure for centuries, but over the past 4+ years since I've been a commissioner at the PUCO and now chair at the PUCO, a lot has happened in the Buckeye State. We have been ground zero for some of what we'll just call the hottest issues in the energy space, whether it's the shale gas revolution and the continued evolving of our generation resource mix, the clean energy debate, if we're talking, whether we're talking about renewables and energy efficiency standards, or the Clean Power Plan, whether it's opposition or support, and how would we figure out intelligible compliance. And of course, the topic of discussion for today, which really surrounds this concept of state subsidies for generating units. And I'm going to do just a very brief history lesson, because I think it will inform the discussion for the rest of the day today. So I was sworn in as a commissioner at the PUCO in June of 2013, and in December of 2013, the first PPA case was filed at the commission. These PPA cases received a lot of press, received a lot of coverage, but they were essentially requests from AEP and eventually First Energy to subsidize effectively approximately 7,000 megawatts through a state subsidy approved by the Public Utilities Commission of Ohio. Now, we've had some state subsidies that have been that have moved forward since. They have been legislative endeavors. So this was an attempt through the Public Utilities Commission of Ohio to subsidize primarily coal and a nuclear unit. This was hotly contested litigation. Some of the folks in the room participated in that litigation. Some of the folks in the room testified in that litigation. Sorry, Hisham, he's sitting over there. Multiple times probably in that litigation. And of course, my Vice Chair Beth Trombold and I were adjudicators of these cases. The PUCO, after extensive litigation, we granted these state subsidies. That would have been, I can't get the dates right anymore, so I won't even go there. So we granted these subsidies. I believe it was, I'm going to say March of 16. March of 16, we granted these subsidies, and very soon, these subsidy cases landed in the laps of the then FERC, the Norman Bay-led FERC. Pretty soon after we granted the subsidies, the FERC effectively sent the cases back to us. And that was in May of 2016. So here we sit today. Where we sit today is and then another intervening event happened between then and now, which is I was sworn in as chairman in June, or actually, no, late May of that same year of 2016. So, PUCO grants state subsidies for roughly 7,000 megawatts of primarily coal-fired generation and a nuclear generating unit. The FERC reverses. I get sworn in as chair. So, my position on state subsidies since that case, and it's not only that case, my position has also been informed by the New Jersey and Maryland cases on new generation. The Hughes decision has also been informed by our own Supreme Court of Ohio, which has told the PUCO effectively, please stop providing dollars to generating units. This is called transition revenue, and you can't do it anymore. So because of all of that, my position when I was sworn in as chairman was that the PUCO is out of the generation business. We are not going to try and thread the needle, carefully parsing words from three different venues, our Supreme Court, the Supreme Court of the United States, and the FERC, associated with trying to assist generating units that are struggling. So that has been my position with respect to the state subsidy generation piece, and so we've been out of the mix for a little bit. What has become clear is that PJM, our regional wholesale market operator, is going to take this issue on. And if PJM is going to take this issue on, then Ohio is going to re-engage in the dialogue. And we have to re-engage in the dialogue, and I think it's appropriate for us to re-engage in the dialogue because obviously we want to ensure that we are advocating for a solution that is best for Ohio and the residents and businesses of Ohio. And so two just additional pieces of commentary, and then I'll turn things over to my colleagues, and then we'll look forward to answering questions up here. So when I say that we obviously need to advocate and try and do what's best for the residents and businesses in Ohio, I would say there's always been this implicit cooperation between the states and those that are in our regional wholesale marketplace. There almost has to be. We're all sort of in it together. And so you combine that with what I would call some implicit cooperation between federal and state, a sort of cooperative federalism concept that we've always operated under. And I think we have been collectively able to work out solutions on matters great and small. I don't know where the power's housed, and I don't mean that as a pun. I really don't know what the power dynamics are in the country right now. It's hard to get a pulse. I have participated in discussions where the question was asked, will states lead the way? Or are we going to have some uniform policy at the federal level to create sort of the next iteration of the marketplaces and try and figure out what's going to happen with these generating units? You know, for me, the answer is still, I don't know. I think clearly you can see that states have taken their own measures, but at the same time, I think that US DOE study pretty clearly teed up. I don't think it was terribly revealing of information that we didn't already collectively know, but I also think that it teed up the issue, and it teed up the issue for a reason. And so I think we are going to obviously go into these discussions trying to be very constructive, but at the same time, I think, me personally at least, I'm playing a little feel-out game about sort of where the power structure right now is housed, because I think figuring that out is important to try and determine what a path forward will be. If it's, and I'll just conclude with that particular comment by saying that will it be a state isolation type of dynamic, or will it be we are actually all sort of collectively cooperating to try and solve the issue, number one. Number two, I wonder if we are past the why question, okay? Because in Ohio, when we dealt with these cases, we asked from a policy and from a very technical standpoint the why question. Are we beyond the why question? And my personal opinion is I hope we are not beyond the why question, because I think even if it is you know, sort of a fait accompli, even if we are going to do something collectively in the marketplace, I think asking the why question is important, because I think that will create the most appropriate solution at the end of the day. And I'm happy to delve into those concepts and discuss those concepts a little more through Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. Vice Chairman.
All right, thank you. I might try the podium. I feel like I'm one of the usual suspects in Casablanca, and I'm about to get interrogated by Colonel Strasser with the bright lights. So we'll see if this is a bit more manageable. Sorry about that. With all due respect to my esteemed colleague from the Buckeye State, I will note that we probably we would argue we're ground zero in these issues. So we can duke it out over lunch. Yeah,
that's utterly false, but that's, go ahead.
Yeah, we will draw this to a close. Yes, of course, shale gas plays a fundamentally important role right now in what we're thinking about from a policy perspective. Pennsylvania's got the 3 legs of the stool. We are arguably, I think, the 2nd largest state in gas production. I think we're 4th or 5th in nuclear. I think we're, sorry, 2nd in nuclear. Thank you very much. Excellent. And I think 4th in coal. And we're a large exporter. We come with a lot of legacy issues. It's a big industrial state. It's a populous state, 12 or 13 million people. Somewhat stagnant population, increasingly elderly population. Income inequalities, of course, like a lot of our northeastern and northern Midwestern states. We deal with these underlying legacy frictions that continue to challenge us and often put things in tension or in trying to find equanimity between these. Struggle with competitiveness, of course, and in the electric realm, flat electric demand. We are politically probably conservative, if not parochial, and I don't mean that in a pejorative sense, but that's the makeup of our legislature and much of our populace. So, and again, don't take that as a parochial or a pejorative comment. James Carville once referred to Pennsylvania, the T. You have these 2 big metropolitan areas, really vibrant cities, Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, with the center of the state and the northern tier of the state being Alabama. I would argue with that, and I was at a meeting yesterday with someone who argue with that and lived in State College, said absolutely not. This is the best place, almost heaven, to live. And I think he was wrong in calling that a pejorative, but it is something of a helpful rubric to think about the state. And there is heterogeneity across. The only thing don't take it too literally about the T and the 2 corners, these 2 metropolitan areas. But we have great heterogeneity and great diversity in the interests and the expected outcomes from much of our populace. And it doesn't really matter if you're in the Golden Triangle in Pittsburgh or Homestead, where Andrew Carnegie's mill was and continues to struggle with outmigration and economic competitiveness, or rural Pennsylvania or the suburbs of Philly. If you think about sort of where we're going as a Commonwealth over the last 15, 20 years, and certainly looking out into the future, I'm bullish on the Commonwealth. I'm not a native. I grew up in Europe and Cincinnati. Actually, I went to high school in Cincinnati. But we do continue to think about the challenges of these 2 very dynamic cities and very vibrant cities. But across the board, we're talking electricity, natural gas, telecommunications, water. We have a lot of urban-rural divide issues that I'm challenged with. I own a farm south of the city of Pittsburgh, and we raise sheep and cattle in the foothills of the Appalachians. And the distinct difference between my life in the city, we have a house in the city near Carnegie Mellon, and what the economic situation is in southwestern Pennsylvania, an old coal town, struggling with telecommunications. We've got DSL Light. I can barely do business and literally cannot do business from my farm anymore. If I need to communicate with my office, I drive the top of the hill with all the other residents who are parked along the ridgetops, connecting to the first world. And what those implications are quite dramatic. And again, given a state that is not only polarized in this urban-rural dynamic, but also with a very large rural population. I believe Pennsylvania has the largest rural population of any state in the nation. Those continue to challenge us. And if you think about what we're here today thinking about, but also broadly all these utility questions, all of them challenge us when we're thinking about that diversity of that population. That said, it's gas. How we bring that to market, it raises a lot of questions and climate issues, local environmental air quality issues, water quality issues, land use issues, and how much petchem we'll have. We're likely to get 3 to 5 large pet crackers. how that impacts not only the regional economy, but local concerns as well, and sort of equity and environmental justice questions is very much part and parcel of the conversations that you hear within the Harrisburg and disparately throughout the Commonwealth. Life cycle emissions, not only thinking about we're displacing coal, which again is a tension within our Commonwealth because we're, again, a big coal producer. So we end up with both winners and losers within the Commonwealth. We're somewhat insulated from the disparity that much of southern West Virginia has faced, that they have one and not the other. So we're in that way blessed, but it does continue to challenge us in how we think about this transition, how far this transition would go. That said, we have these fabulous resources on hand to do with if we do it well. As I noted, economic development continues to challenge us. How much will we become a resource colony? We are, as I noted, a big exporter of all of the above, gas, coal, and electricity. But how much are we keeping in the states? And if you look at retail rates, whether it's gas or electricity, we continue to be fairly expensive. So how much of the gas resource is trickling down to residents and commercial and industrial continues to challenge our economic development folks. On the nuclear issue, we have 10.3 gigawatts of installed capacity. For us, the resilience and the competitiveness, ongoing competitiveness of those plants is very much this year's challenge. And the three legs of what we could think about doing, whether we contemplate a carbon price, which is a challenge in our political environment, of course, whether we do a ZEC, or whether you do none of the above. And those, we can talk about that further through this panel, but I'm not a betting man. I guess I'm in Ohio, so I could probably quote Pete Rose, who said, if I was a betting man, which I'm not, I'd be willing to bet that. But it's very difficult to sort of read those tea leaves and know which direction Pennsylvania is going, and in part because the budget questions, we're one of many states that are very much challenged on the fiscal side, and our legislature, all the oxygen is being consumed by these, and this year's debate has been going on ad infinitum into the past and is likely to in the future. But I think that has kept much of the sort of the nuclear question out of the forefront of much of the legislative conversation, although much is going on behind the scenes. But that said, just in closing, the why question challenges me as well, as the chairman noted. I come from an academic background and I also worked in upstream oil and gas, but in some ways the nuclear question to me is quantitatively pretty straightforward. We deal with, as I noted, a lot of these equity questions, low income, modest income, legacy issues throughout the Commonwealth and its large population. Those are tough policy choices. Those are really tough to figure out what the sweet spot may be, if there is even a sweet spot. But in this question, analytically, I'm not really challenged by it. Again, that's sort of what we'll talk about for 2 days, and I don't want to seed the water here, but I look at this as the unmonetized externality of the value of the attribute of the emissions output from our generation. I'm somewhat less concerned about the resiliency or the energy mix. I think some of those are taken care of. Looking at the analysis that's come out of PJM and what we've seen from many other sources, I think of those as secondary concerns. But I am concerned about the potential of losing that much generation of zero carbon resources and what that means, perhaps not today, but 10 years out, 15 years out. Will we look back with great regret if those units have left the mix? So I don't want to, again, draw this to a close and leave nothing for the conversation, but for that, if we're just thinking about that one boxed-in, bracketed question, I'm pretty firm where I think we can potentially go and what the moderate income or modest income or impacts might be on the Commonwealth if we were to go, say, a carbon route. So with that, I'll close. Thank you.
Okay, good morning. My name is Michael Dowd. I am the Director of the Air and Renewable Energy Division of the Virginia Department of Environmental Quality. I like to add the renewable energy part because it's now an important part of what we do at DEQ and put it in the title of our division to emphasize that importance. Now, unlike the distinguished gentleman to my right here, I am not an expert in electricity markets. However, over the past couple of years, whether I've liked to or not, I have been forced to learn quite a bit about carbon regulation and carbon programs for various reasons. And somebody has told me that if a state regulates carbon, it may have an impact on electricity prices. I guess, so we'll see. But I've been told that by people a lot smarter than me. So exciting things are happening in Virginia now with respect to carbon regulation, and I'll tell you where we're going. We're probably the only state that is actively pursuing only new state that's actively pursuing an overall carbon regulatory program. I'll give you a little background. Back in the old days when we had the Clean Power Plan, when that was still out there, and it seems like forever ago, remember the Supreme Court stayed it. Well, in response to the Supreme Court stay, the Virginia General Assembly passed a little provision in its budget saying that DEQ could not spend any money developing the Clean Power Plan, working on the Clean Power Plan until the stay was lifted. Well, in response to that, after that General Assembly session, Governor Terry McAuliffe issued an executive order to his Secretary of Natural Resources to convene a work group to examine how the state of Virginia could regulate carbon emissions from fossil fuel-fired electric generating facilities using existing state authority. So Secretary Ward convened the work group. It met several times over the past, really in 16 and early 17. Had, I think, about 6 meetings, took 40 presentations, received about 6,000 public comments. In the meantime, while the public process on this work group was continuing, we had the election. And then it seemed like the Clean Power Plan was going to go away for good. So the work group sort of took on, sort of added importance, because we really didn't have the Clean Power Plan anymore, and what was Virginia to do with carbon regulation? Well, the work group came out with a series of recommendations. The first recommendation of the work group was that Virginia should consider adopting a carbon control program for fossil fuel-fired plants that was linkable to other programs around. And at the time, still presently, the really only viable program to link to is Reggie, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative of the Northeast states. So that recommendation went to the governor, along with several others. And then shortly after receiving those recommendations, Governor McAuliffe issued Executive Directive 11, directing the Department of Environmental Quality in consultation with the Secretary of Natural Resources to develop a rule to control carbon emission from fossil fuel-fired generating plants under existing state authority that was trading ready. Well, what does trading ready mean? That meant developing a program that would be linkable to Reggie. And that, I think ED 11 came out in June. We were told to prepare the regulation by the end of the year, a large task. We have had an extensive public process. We had a regulatory advisory panel made up of expert stakeholders, and they were basically was the same group we had for our Clean Power Plan. We had a public comment period. We've received over 2,500 public comments. The comment period and the stakeholder process have wrapped up. In the meantime, when we've looked at schedules, we are looking to prepare a reg that's linkable to Reggie to present as a proposed regulation to our State Air Pollution Control Board in the middle of November, on November 16th. Now, at the same time, while we have been developing a process internally, the last thing we want to do at DEQ or in Virginia is develop a linkable program that Reggie isn't going to accept. You know, we don't want to be told when we propose something, Reggie's saying, oh, wait, wow, this isn't going to work. So at the same time we've been working internally on our state process, we have also been discussing having talks with Reggie states themselves about where we're going with our regulation. So sort of two balls up in the air at the same time. Our thinking is that we want to develop a rule that's as close to the new Reggie model rule as possible, including their emission containment reserve and other new aspects to the Reggie rule as well. One big difference between the rule we will propose and Reggie will be that all the Reggie states auction allowances. In Virginia, we will not be directly auctioning allowances because we do not believe that we can do so without having the permission of, without having legislation from our General Assembly, because it involves raising money. So how do we get around that? It's not a question of getting around it, it's a question of coming up with an allowance allocation system that does not involve auctioning or direct auctioning. So that's one big difference between what we will be doing and what Reggie will be doing. We'll be allocating allowances. How will we make our program, therefore, more compatible with Reggie that does auction? Well, we're seriously considering an approach called a consignment auction, and I can tell you more about that in question and answers. It's not a very complex process. We are continuing to go over ways that we would allocate allowances, whether it's to generators or load-serving entities. We are thinking about ways to create set-asides, especially with respect to energy efficiency. That's an important goal of our governor. So we're looking at ways to construct an energy set-aside program. The size of the set-aside and exactly the details of how it would be implemented are still up in the air at the moment. But we're coming to crunch time. We have to get the regulation presentable, ready prime time by November 16th. So we are drafting regulatory language now, although we are still meeting with folks. We've had an open door policy at DEQ. We chat with a couple of interested parties every week, it seems. Just this morning, I was on the phone a bit with our regulatory drafter back in Richmond going over language, saying, yeah, this works, this probably doesn't. So we're well on the way to developing the rule. The rule has to be presented to our board in prime time by November 16th. We have to get it to the board a couple of weeks in advance of that. So, and when we send it to the board, it will become public at that point. So it'll be public probably a couple of weeks, 2 or 3 weeks before we have our meeting. So it'll be sometime in late October, I would assume, that our trading ready reg will be ready. As I said, we still have a lot of balls in the air. Our discussions with Reggie are beyond the initial phases. We're certainly in the middle game, I would say now. Everybody is saying the right things. Everybody at Reggie wants to get it done. Everyone in Virginia wants to get it done. So we'll see what happens. I'm trying to, are there any other notes here? That's really it, Doug. And how that will affect electricity prices is anybody's guess. Oh, one thing I do want to add, we are doing modeling. We are doing modeling, but the modeling's not ready for prime time yet. So I was hoping to have it ready today for the group, but it's not quite ready to go.
Let me start there with you, Mike. And not obviously you don't have results of it, but what are you looking for the modeling to tell you? What do you want? What do you want to learn from the modeling?
We want to learn what the we're running a base case scenarios and policy scenarios. Of course, you want to see what the difference is in several factors. One of them is you want to see what your emission reduction would be. Our intention at the moment would be to follow the Reggie path. Basically, I know Reggie uses numbers, but basically it's 3% per year, 3% decline per year from a 2020 baseline. What our baseline will be is not determined yet. So we will obviously want to look at what our CO2 reductions would be under various scenarios. We'll want to see what that cost is in two respects. First, the cost on firm power prices. And second, the cost on Reggie allowances. I mean, that's a big deal. Reggie, takes its allowance, its auction program very, very seriously. We'd be the only state not directly auctioning, but I think Reggie came up with an initial cap for its new phase of like 75 million tons. If Virginia links to Reggie, we would be throwing into the pot 30-something, 32, 33, whatever. We don't know the number yet, but we'd be throwing in an awful lot of allowances into the Reggie system. So it could be quite a shock to the system. So the modeling with respect to how our joining Reggie, using the Reggie model rule program elements, how that would affect the allowance prices is something Reggie is certainly very, very interested in.
Sure.
And a key component.
Well, let me ask you too, before I move on to the other gentleman too, but you're talking about it linking to Reggie as opposed to joining Reggie or as opposed to doing something on your own. Can you maybe go through a little of that analysis and why you're landing where you are?
Well, sure. You know, the governor decided in Executive Directive 11 to come up with a linkable program. And it turns out, you know, linking to Reggie is really the only viable approach if you're going to link. I think our thinking grew out of all the work that was done on the Clean Power Plan, where it became clear that the most cost-effective way to regulate carbon from the fossil fuel generators is through a broad-based trading program. You could do it alone. The modeling we saw back for the Clean Power Plan was it's more expensive to do it alone if you have a do-it-alone program. As you remember, the Clean Power Plan gave states options to do a lot of various different things. So we came to the conclusion that that's the cheapest, the most cost-effective way to go would be to join an existing trading program, and that was Reggie, rather than try it alone.
Chairman Haque, let me ask a couple questions to you about the PPAs that you mentioned early on, and there's kind of a theme I want to get to and explore, because it isn't necessarily always just about the type of generation. It is in Director Dowd's case, because they're directly talking about reducing greenhouse gases. But in yours, the PPAs talked about helping both coal and at least one nuclear plant. Could you maybe go into what the rationale behind that was? Is it the job case? Is it tax base? What were the important factors behind that?
Yeah, I think it was a whatever sticks approach, and that varies. And I mean, I don't necessarily mean that to be facetious. I mean, 5 commissioners come from their own particular backgrounds and have their own particular sets of priorities. We've got one of our legislators in the back, Senator Beagle, who chairs our Senate Public Utilities Committee in the state, and I think he'd probably tell you the same about his legislative members. And so the policy discussions and the policy rationale really span the gamut. I think we undoubtedly heard concerns about reliability and what will happen to the system when all of these, thousands of megawatts of coal and this one nuclear plant leave the system, base load. Okay, and this is something that you are now hearing with consistency across the country. The zero carbon attributes of the one nuclear unit was a policy piece that was utilized in those cases. The viability of the two utilities, the financial viability of the two utilities, and their difficulty because of their generation affiliate. Their financial difficulties were undoubtedly part of the equation. And then, of course, you have the concept of jobs and economic development as well. That was part of the equation with respect to those cases. And so it presents a tremendous challenge because I think when you start looking at this situation regionally, I think every state that has dealt with the state subsidy issue will have sort of its own tale of how the sauce was made. And what's really kind of fascinating to watch is sort of the broad characterization of the state subsidy, but they all begin somewhere with some rationale, with either some legislator or state public utilities commissioner or commission that have relied on particular justifications for it.
So you've said, I've heard you say it before, and I heard you say it again this morning, that you're out of the generation business, but clearly Ohio's still looking at these issues in a lot of different ways. So you've got, there was a bill that didn't pass, but to to subsidize the at least 2 nuclear plants in the state. You've got a re-regulation proposal that's out there. How involved do you get with any of those issues as they come before the legislature, or not at all?
Yeah, well, the Commission's role is to try and be a neutral arbiter of information. And I think that is a voice that's needed in the state. Obviously, the stakeholders in the state will come from really varied perspectives and varied financial interests. And so when called upon by the legislature to provide information or try and make heads and tails of all of the information that they're receiving from the innumerable number of stakeholders in this state with skin in the game, that's really the role that we play. And so if the legislature decides that there will be a state subsidy for Unit A, then we will do what the legislature asks of us and implement whatever they ask us to do.
And if there's re-regulation, you'll really be back in the generation business.
That is right. That is correct.
Very good. Vice Chairman, please, let me ask you a couple questions about playing off of some of the things that you brought up. You talked about the second in the nation in terms of the nuclear load in Pennsylvania, and also not just the large amount of coal and how important that is in a lot of communities throughout the state, but then also you're at the forefront of the shale gas revolution as well. Could you maybe talk about how because I assume the shale gas in the Marcellus play is going to keep influencing the generation in your state. How does that play out with gas versus the coal and the nuclear generation that you've got?
Thank you. Yeah, that's a good question. If you look at it graphically, the BTUs that are producing from gas, even today, and certainly looking out into 2020, they dwarf what we're doing in anything else, whether it's coal or nuclear or renewables. They are the 400-pound gorilla, for better. I'm not saying that's a good or a bad thing. It just quantitatively, it is what it is. It's the 400-pound gorilla. So they are getting the lion's share of focus from all sorts of different constituencies. Both nuclear and coal are having absolutely significant, very real headwinds from, particularly from gas. To some extent, EPA regulation, to some extent, renewables, but in many ways, those are on the margin compared to what gas is doing. The amount of generation that's being built in the Commonwealth. If we were to lose nuclear or some portion of our nuclear fleet, we have some bifurcation between the nuclear plants that are economically viable and those that are arguably not. I mean, whether there's a lot of pressure on Beaver Valley, there's a lot of pressure on TMI, 3 Mile Island, but whether the other three are longer term, have better prospects, you can argue that point. And we've already lost much of our coal generation, and those that remain, we've lost the 1930s low efficiency coal generators, and what are left are some supercritical plants that are arguably still viable. I don't see those going away. We're not going to go to, absolutely we're not going to go to zero, but a supercritical plant, Bruce Mansfield, which is adjacent to Beaver Valley Nuclear Facility just north of Pittsburgh, is remarkably under stress. And I wouldn't have, 10 years ago, I would look at Bruce Mansfield, absolutely not. That's fundamental to base load. That's running 24/7. Full throttle.
Under stress economically.
Under stress economically. But the world has turned on that. So for all of those reasons, shale gas really is driving not only sort of the economics of this, but also the political winds and the what gets tension or gets attention in all these different constituencies. So unlike Ohio particularly, I don't think we're going to get a strong, significant push to subsidize coal generation. I could be wrong, and to some extent, reading tea leaves is a fool's game. But again, 10 years ago, I would have argued that the coal lobby and the coal interests would have had a very strong sway. but that's really been displaced by gas. And nuclear, that's a tough call. Again, speaking of what I spoke of here, the diversity, the complexity of the Pennsylvania economy, there's certainly a strong effort to maintain the nuclear presence, driven by the tax base and the employment, the economic interests around those plants. But the pushback from consumers, from gas, from the chemical and manufacturing sector, that's also a very strong voice in the Commonwealth. It's not, the world really has changed. It's not really as binary as it once was. But all of that really is because of this extraordinary volume of gas coming in. That day by day, our minds are blown by how much gas there really is. And yes, there's environmental pushback, and that's really my career's been spent in this nexus of energy and environment. But ultimately, if I'm standing back and I'm looking at the end game here, yeah, there's resistance to building pipe. There's the resistance, the epithet of fracking. And some of that's not without merit. I mean, I'm not arguing that, of course. And there's the question of climate of gas versus coal. There's also the question of gas climate impacts versus renewables. But at the end of the day, if you're looking at on the ground where we're likely to be in 10 years, again, if I was a betting man, I'd say that the pipe gets built. We are sending a lot of gas to the northeast. We're sending a lot of gas to the southeast. We have a very strong and vibrant chemicals and manufacturing use as a primary fuel, as feedstock, and that comes to fruition, not without tensions, not without concerns. As I said, I used to work in the natural gas business. We were very concerned about local air emissions questions and the climate impacts of what we were doing. But I think technically and from an engineering perspective, those are surmountable, and the opposition isn't to the degree like in Europe or in Britain or in Germany, where you might close down this development. I just don't see it happening where we are.
So let me follow up with just one more question on this. You talked about the nuclear plants, and you made you talked about the unmonetized externality of the GHG-free emissions that they've got. You've got a task force, not you personally, but Pennsylvania has a task force that's looking at this issue. And you said that that discussion had kind of been driven to the sidelines or behind the scenes. Can you maybe tell us a little bit about that and what their charge is and what might likely happen as a result of that group?
Yeah, it's a caucus, not a task force.
Oh, I'm sorry.
It's probably a distinction, but...
it is a distinction, yeah.
But yeah, again, I think that it's more or less... I don't see it, and others in this room are probably more capable of speaking to what's really going on in there better than I am, but I don't see it as really pushing hard for... they're not coming out of the gate right now and saying, we need a ZEC, we need some sort of support. A lot of that caucus is not solely those who want to maintain those plants. It is really a broad spectrum of folks that want to be in the room and have a conversation in that. Okay. So I think from my perspective, I think you need to be careful to think of it as a sort of a broad-based conversation, but yet to have the question is still very much out on what, if anything, will come out of that effort.
Both on whether to do something, and if so, what that would be, whether it would be a ZEC or some other kind of subsidy or something like that. Okay, thank you. Let me go back to you, Director Dowd. A couple of the questions that would come up, and interesting is listening to you talk about this, because and I know you would have talked about this either with the commission or with folks from PJM or with others, but the reliability issues that are, if any, caused by doing a whole GHG reduction plan in your state, and then not the way we thought of it under Clean Power Plan, but kind of the leakage issue. Does that mean, do you worry that some of the generators in your state will take up residence in a different state or something along those lines?
Well, let me first start, Doug, with the first question on reliability. We do have discussions with the staff over at the Our State Corporation Commission, SCC. They know what we're doing. We've kept them informed along the way. When we look towards a program that links to Reggie Thus far, there has been, from what I understand, no reliability issues in the Reggie region. We're looking to that as sort of as an example of how this would work. We have no indication so far that there'd be any reliability issues at the moment if we were to link to Reggie. We've had no one has come to us saying, hey, this could be a real problem. Now, we're still waiting for some modeling results, and I want to emphasize that what we're doing is it's a proposed regulation, so when we issue it, when the State Air Pollution Control Board approves it, it's not the last bite at the apple. If any reliability issues come, there are enough safety valves in the process that they will be dealt with along the way, but at the moment, we don't know of any such issues with Reggie, and we don't foresee any going forward if we link to Reggie. And I forget, what was your other question?
The leakage issue.
Oh, the leakage issue, yes. That's a very important issue for us, for our stakeholders as we go forward. It's an important issue for Reggie folks as well as they talk to us. To the extent, if we join Reggie, I understand it prevents leakage from us to Reggie. It's sort of I don't want to say like a creeping, it's like a creeping program. The more states that join, the leakage could always be pushed out to the margins. So if we join Reggie, then Maryland's leaking problem apparently is solved. However, we would have there's an obviously a risk that there would be leakage of imported power into Virginia. A couple of thoughts on that. I think it's a little simplistic just to say that, well, if there's a price of carbon in the Reggie area, our utilities are immediately going to go out and buy cheaper power elsewhere. Of course, that may occur. On the other hand, there are other factors. Virginia is still a vertically integrated state, regulated state. We have in state code a provision that favors the construction of in-state generation as opposed to imported power. It is a matter of state policy, and the SEC, is obliged to follow this, that it is better in Virginia, it's been determined it's better to have native generation than it is to import power. So even though it may be cheaper to import some power, say from West Virginia or Kentucky, there are other countervailing factors in Virginia that might say, hey, we want to build base load here in Virginia. Now, that can have a whole range of impacts. I'm not saying that's necessarily a good thing, but it would be something that would mitigate leakage, obviously. Another thing is how we allocate allowances is important. There are indications that depending on how you allocate, there are certain methods of allocation, say output-based updating, might ameliorate a leakage problem more than other types of allocations. So that's what we're looking at now. We don't know the full answer to it.
Did you want to go just for a second and talk about the consignment auction and what that means? Because I think that's a good topic.
Sure. And I can't take credit for this idea. I think it was Franz who's been working with us very closely. We're very lucky to have some very good consultants with us. Franz and Kate Zeiler from the Georgetown Climate Center and Dallas Bertra have been working with us very closely. When we first were thinking, hey, how are we going to make a Reggie program work? They all auction their allowances. We can't do that. What are we going to do with our allowances? Franz said, hey, well, there's something out there called a consignment auction. And well, what was that? What is that? Well, and the concept is really very simple. It's where we allocate allowances to entities on whatever basis, whether it's on generating or load serving or whatever. We allocate them, but they're allocated conditionally. And what I mean by that is they're allocated conditionally so long as they take the allowances, we allocate them, and then they consign them to an auction program. In this case, it would be the Reggie auction. And then all the allowances, supposing we allocate Dominion, they get 1 million allowances. They would have to take the allowances we allocate to them and consign them to the Reggie auction. Dominion would then go to the Reggie auction and then purchase all its compliance allowances from the auction, but in turn, they would be reimbursed at the Reggie auction clearing price for all the allowances that they were sold at whatever. So, for instance, if their compliance, if we consign them 1 million, or we allocate them on a consignment basis, 1 million allowances, and their compliance needs are 1.5 million allowances, what would happen is Dominion consigns its 1 million allowances, we allocate to the Reggie auction. Dominion then goes in there, goes into the Reggie auction, purchases 1.5 million allowances. However, they are then reimbursed. Say they sold all million allowances were sold at auction, they would be reimbursed at the clearing price for what those allowances brought in sale. So there'd be a delta there, and the delta, you know, their compliance cost versus what they're reimbursed from the Reggie auction. That's basically how that works. Now, Reggie also has a requirement that 25% of the allocations go to a public good, go to public benefit, go back to the ratepayers. And maybe some of that can be taken care of in a set-aside. But keep in mind, again, as I said, Virginia is still a regulated state. So the theory goes that all the value of the allowances that are allocated would, if the State Corporation Commission is doing its job under the structure that is currently in place, the allowance prices that they're reimbursed, the allowance money that they're reimbursed would flow back to the ratepayers. So the ratepayers wouldn't be paying for, in my earlier example, 1.5 million allowances, compliance allowances. They would be paying for the 0.5 million because Dominion was reimbursed on the first million. Okay. Does that make sense?
Yes.
I know it took. We had Dallas Bertraw give a whole webinar on this twice, actually, once to the public and then once to our State Air Pollution Control Board. But I think it's a relatively simple concept, and I'll say I don't think I'm talking out of school here. Reggie seems to like that approach.
Actually, the fact you're vertically integrated may actually help you
Yes.
work through that process.
Well,
it makes it a little bit easier, I think.
Well, it does, and we think it also serves the public good part of the Reggie requirement, because they're required, you know, our State Corporation Commission really is required to make sure that the value of the allowances that are consigned do go back to the ratepayers. So there should not be a situation of windfall profits.
I've got one more question for each of the other two gentlemen, so be thinking about your questions. When these are done, I will call on Franz to move around the room and start taking questions from the audience. Vice Chairman, please, I'm going to stay on the Reggie theme for just a minute. There was talk back at the time of the last gubernatorial election in Pennsylvania that you might be thinking about as a state joining Reggie. That didn't happen. Is that talk kind of gone away now, or?
Yeah, I would suspect so. It's not infeasible. It's not possible that be the case. It's a question whether the governor could do it on his own or would need legislative approval to do it. I would suspect that whether it's legally permissible for the governor to do it is somewhat irrelevant. I suspect that he probably wouldn't step out on his own away from the legislature's will to do it, or the legislature might step in and push back. But again, you spend any time in Harrisburg and you realize that everything revolves around the budget question, and everyone's tippy-toeing around the edges on any other issue. That's my sense, and the impact on how we negotiate our way through the budget question. It would be an interesting proposition. I would certainly welcome it if Pennsylvania chose to go that way. But I also think maybe from an elegance perspective and maybe thinking about the peculiarities or the uniqueness of Pennsylvania, that going it alone might have more appeal. And whether that's politically palatable, again, is a really open question. But the nuclear issue has kind of dropped into this debate and brought disparate groups together to have a conversation about how you might thread the needle or solve this issue. So those lead me to think that, yeah, maybe the way forward on a climate issue is not a direct Reggie, yes, we're going to do this, but an indirect backdoor saying, hey, unusual group of folks from disparate groups have their own rationales for wanting to go this direction, and now's a good moment to do it, and do it in an ad hoc, and whether, again, a heavy lift. I don't want anyone to come out of this conversation thinking this is it's very likely at all in Pennsylvania. ZECs are probably more likely, but from my perspective, the elegance, the ability to be fuel agnostic, putting a price on carbon within the energy markets within PJM on a sub-regional basis within Pennsylvania, deal with the border adjustment issues. I think that's all technically feasible, and yeah, maybe the time, yeah, anyone's guess, but maybe this interesting framework where that could possibly come
Very
about.
good. Thank you. And last question that I have is for Chairman Haque. I want to talk about the Power Forward a little bit, which Power Forward in Ohio, I immediately thought of LeBron James and then found out it was something very different than that. So maybe if you could talk about that a little bit, because obviously that will have an influence in terms of generation mix if you're adding a lot more distributed energy, and I know you're looking at all of those issues, so maybe just say a little bit about that.
I appreciate that. So Power Forward is the Commission's grid modernization endeavor. It is a little different than some of the other grid modernization proceedings that we have seen. It's really built upon two pillars, which are the concepts of innovation, both technological and regulatory innovation, and the concept of enhancing the customer electricity experience. I still have not gotten my IP protection on that particular phrase, but I need to get it shorn up here shortly. I think that undoubtedly one of the potential yields from Power Forward will be this concept of how to better enhance the concept of decentralization. I mean, I think that is a very natural yield from this. There will be other natural yields from this as well. You know, decarbonization is a natural yield from this as well. But we look at this purely from the lens of how are we going to collectively make the customer's utility experience a better experience than what they're receiving today. I think it is a rare snapshot in time whereby there is governmental will at the Commission, that it is a very customer-focused event. So very good for Ohioans. And I think that when you start talking about utilities needs, clearly this is an opportunity for utilities going forward. Just based purely upon the concept of investments and where they're going to park capital. Mm-hmm. So there's this tremendous symmetry, and we are trying to take advantage of that symmetry right now while it still exists.
Good, thank you. All right, we've got about 20 minutes for questions from the audience, and so just raise your hand and Franz will come around with the mic, and if you could just tell us who you are and who you represent here today when you ask your question.
I also have a few questions from the web. Those of you on the web can send in your questions and they'll make it into the room through me.
Anybody
Any questions
first?
in the room?
Yeah. Mike here.
Hey, thank you. Good morning. I'm curious.
Tell us who you are.
Mike Cashin, Minnesota Power Elite. Michael, you mentioned a bit about the consignment auction, and I find that interesting, and that the pass-through would have the utility basically bid to be neutral on what they need, but it also includes a component that gets attached by the Reggie process where 25% goes to the special projects, and essentially that gets borne by the consumers. Isn't that kind of working like a tax mechanism through the energy markets? You know, for projects that the state might have wanted to fund directly?
Yeah, not necessarily. The Reggie requirement, originally Reggie wasn't going to auction allowances, it was going to allocate them, sort of like we're doing now, and then it discovered that an auction way was, auctions were more, they could raise more money through an auction. The 25% for public good is there, and it's a point we're discussing with Reggie. It's not quite as simple as saying we're going to take, we don't think it's as simple as just saying, hey, we're taking 25% of the allowances and doing public good with them. There are several things we have to be very careful of. But before I get to that, just on the point that we are a regulated state, the public benefit, or so I understand, can be construed to be that when the State Corporation Commission does its job and takes the value of the allowances that are reimbursed to, I'll say the allocated entities, reimbursed to the allocated entities when they, when the State Corporation Commission flows that back to the ratepayers. Now, you know, it's not a perfect situation because not all the allocations in Virginia would be made to, you know, supposing we do it to generators or load-serving entities, either one, not all of them, not all the allocations will necessarily be made to entities that are under the jurisdiction of the State Corporation Commission. For instance, if IPPs get some, they're not under the jurisdiction. So not all of the money that's recouped by entities necessarily would flow back to ratepayers. But at least in Virginia, a very, very large percentage of it would. And we think that that goes a long way to satisfying the Reggie requirement that 25% be set aside for public good. And we've been talking to Reggie about that, and I think they understand that. If we do a set-aside, which we are looking at, you know, the set-aside would be geared to you know, energy efficiency programs that are workable, that would reduce emissions. And it would be tied to, you know, a belief that we have the authority to do so under the State Air Pollution Control Law. I didn't mention earlier that just before the governor came out with Executive Directive 11, there was an opinion from our Attorney General that said that our State Air Pollution Control Board, in his opinion, has the authority to enact a trading-ready program to link to Reggie. So hopefully that gets to answering your question. We don't believe that a set-aside would be a tax. Clearly, for instance, it would have to be linked somehow to environmental improvement. And, you know, I'll throw out an example. I don't think we would have the authority to allocate allowances to food banks. Even though it might be a very laudable program or goal, we don't think that would be in the authority. But for energy efficiency, which would, you know, which would have the effect of lowering emissions, yeah,
Great, thanks.
We suspect that might be allowable.
Other questions? Or Franz, did you have one from the web you want to read?
Sure, seeing no hands in the room. And bear with me because these come in during the course of your panel, so there may be they may be asking things that I'll try to weed out the redundancies. This relates to Reggie. At the table, we have 2 states that are in proximity to Reggie states. Virginia is thinking about a program that would make them part of the regional carbon market, and Pennsylvania is surrounded by New York, Maryland, Delaware, and New Jersey, where both gubernatorial candidates have pledged to rejoin Reggie. And there's a question for Mr. Dowd and for Vice Chairman Place. First, Mr. Dowd. As you think about Virginia's plan, can you say whether Virginia is thinking about emissions leakage? You already said you are, but this part, and whether the proposal by PJM on carbon pricing might play a role in warding off leakage? Sort of a foreshadowing of the panel this afternoon, but we'll talk about that.
You know, we at DEQ and in the state don't have any authority over, I mean, I think it would be a very large stretch to say that we would have any authority to impose a leakage tax or carbon adder on imported power, which I think is where that's getting to. You know, so we're obviously not looking at it. You know, if all PJM states decide to put the carbon adder on it, you know, that's not something that DEQ deals with directly, but it could certainly, it seems to me it would certainly ameliorate leakage to a large extent. But here again, I think that's, I think we have a lot of discussion to do before we get to that point.
Okay, great. Vice Chairman Place. In some respects, PA generators have a competitive advantage vis-a-vis generators covered by a carbon cap. How do you feel about PJM's proposal that would attempt to remove that advantage and cordon off the carbon cap states from the other states in the market?
Yeah, I do find a lot of elegance in PJM's model. I think it deals with the leakage questions. I think it deals with Pennsylvania's position as an export. In some ways, I'm challenged by what's the price of a metric ton of CO2 in Reggie at the moment? $2, $3?
It's around $4.
For $4.
In most recent auctions.
So, you know, not to be a curmudgeon, but you know, I'm thinking about what's the social cost of carbon? $43, $45, $47 a ton. Does $2 to $3 or $4? Is that sufficient to maintain our nuclear fleet? And in a way, it didn't just disadvantage coal, really just bury coal. But if you really did put a carbon price at the social cost of carbon, is it in the sweet spot for incentivizing CCS? So from that perspective, that's appealing to the Commonwealth. So for those reasons, that's sort of what my thinking is on both the PJM question and the leakage question, as well as the Reggie question.
Very good. Anyone else in the room have a question? Everybody's shy. Go ahead, Franz.
Okay, take another one from the internet. This one is for Chairman Haque. You said we should keep asking the question why. I'm sorry. Wait. You said that we should keep asking the why question and not assume that the answer is yes. Can you please elaborate on that? Are you saying that states should be free to subsidize resources and not have the regional markets address any distortions that arise?
Yeah, no, I'm not saying that. I think that, and this is actually implicit in the guidance or the work that came out of the FERC technical conference. This concept of trying to price these attributes, the attributes of the units that are being subsidized, and so when I really look at the landscape of the state subsidy issue and the state subsidy questions that have been asked in various states, the reasons really vary. And so I just want to ensure that we are attacking this from a scientific approach so that we end up with a policy justification that is then appropriately priced in a marketplace. I mean, that's really hopefully the goal. And I can just only simply say that states have their reasons for doing what they do, and sometimes those reasons are very, very particular and specific to that state. But again, this goes to my concept about, we will always advocate for the states that we come from, and we're always going to promulgate policy for the states that we come from. But there is this regional marketplace that we exist in. And so if we are going to, in fact, do something, and if we have come to that point that something will be done in the regional marketplace, I just want to be sure that we are, when we start to price the subsidy, when we start to affix dollar amounts associated to the subsidy in the marketplace, that we have appropriately asked the why question. Because I think that if you don't, then you could, and let's just not deal with the units that have been subsidized today, okay? Let us also think about what happens in states a year from now, 2 years from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now. What are we potentially going to be subsidizing? And if the policy is just, well, states are going to do their thing, and we've got to figure out how to ensure that what the states have done are incorporated into the marketplace, you're going to create a pretty challenged marketplace. And so my point in saying we need to continue to ask the why question is, we've got to be scientifically solving for a problem that we can then price appropriately.
The follow-up to that would be, if the marketplace, if PJM and the marketplace is developing a policy to help make the state policies work and to do something that will theoretically make it manageable, you're still not going to eliminate states taking other actions, because their rationale for doing that may be very different, as we've seen. If the rationale is protect the tax base in a community where the nuclear plant is the largest taxpayer by far, you don't really get away from that ever, do you? I mean, you're going to keep asking the the why question is going to keep being there, isn't it?
Yeah, and it can become an extraordinarily slippery slope, which is why I think we've just got to be careful heading into this what appears to be a movement for the regional marketplace to deal with some of these subsidies.
Did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, again, not to sound like a broken record, but to me that's part and parcel of why I like the idea of a carbon price. I see what we do with our APS. I mean, to some extent, we have an alternative energy portfolio standard, not an RPS in Pennsylvania. It's on the margins, not particularly impactful on the energy markets, but you see what's happening in other, certainly north of us in New England and New York, and you do see, as Chairman Haque mentioned, the challenge that the markets will have to incorporate those into the capacity markets, for example, without significant distortions. That's a real issue, and I think about the ad hocness of that. Is it for tax-based reasons? Is it for economic development reasons? Right. Is it because we want to do solar? Do we want to do carbon? Do we want to do SO2 and so on? So fundamentally, I come back to that this is a real hodgepodge and very difficult for the markets and PJM to absorb all of this noise and come to rational choices. And so, again, not to beat the drum on this, but take all this spaghetti and just define it down to, as you were saying, the quantitative, the science that says, look, these are the real non-monetized externalities of what are clearly energy issues, and bring them to a construct that can be incorporated in a way that doesn't throw the baby out with bathwater or kills the golden goose. I can go on all day, because we are firm believers in the value of PJM. It has been of substantive value to our economy. And damaging that would be very regrettable if we don't do this in a rational and holistic fashion.
Yeah, I think all you need to do is look at, with our PPA cases, we would have subsidized quite a few coal units. And so that is sort of a look at what a state has done in the recent past. My state has done in the recent past. Then you start looking out towards the future. Who's to say that there won't be boy, we really want to promote battery storage, and we really want to, in the grid mod space, as policy, the state wants to promote these items that would otherwise have to compete in the wholesale marketplace. And so I think, again, I think we just have to ensure that we're not caught up in this particular moment in time. And we will continue to ask the why question for whatever we decide to do with the marketplace.
Great. I think we have time for one more question. Yes, please.
Hi, this is Karen Palmer from Resources for the Future, and my question is for Michael Dowd about Virginia linking with Reggie. One of the new features of Reggie that's being proposed coming out of the 2016 program review is the emission containment reserve, and I'm just curious what Virginia's thinking about participating in that feature.
The short answer is we intend to. That's our thinking at the moment, is that we would basically adopt the Reggie model rule as is, except in specific regions that we can't, like with auctions. Things like that. But yes, we're aware of it. We've just been talking about that with Reggie, looking at modeling prices and things like that. Yeah. Right. We would accept that. No, 2 Reggie states are not, but we would accept it.
Okay. Great. Do you have one more? That was quick, so you have one more?
Yes, actually there's one here. This one is for Vice Chairman Place, and it somewhat retreads ground you've already covered, but there's an element to it. Can you comment on the likelihood that Pennsylvania will implement a measure to assist existing nuclear similar to Illinois and New York? I think the only thing that's new, maybe they're asking you for odds. Or some kind of
Yeah, thank you very much. Nothing like ending on the most difficult question we've had before us today. Oh, God, I don't even know if I could horse race that one. It's really a tough call. I don't know. I guess it depends on what side of the bed I get up in the morning. I think there's strong rationale to think that something could come out to protect at least some units in the Commonwealth. So maybe I'd put it at, all right, probabilistically, 30% something happens, 70% doesn't happen, or maybe 60-40, or 60 against, 44. But let's come back in a year or two and figure out if I was remotely close.
That's right. Pete Rose just got a bet down on it based on what
you said.
Yeah,
I just had that awful feeling. What's the line in probability that good decisions don't guarantee good outcomes and bad decisions don't guarantee bad outcomes? So maybe I have a way to sneak out of that one.
Great. Well, thank you very much, and let's please join me in thanking the panel for a great opening discussion here today. Thank you.
Vice Chairman. Real pleasure.